The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host, Michelle Crimes.
Welcome to the Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Michelle Crimes, and I'm the Deputy Director for CIPE's Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. And I'm really delighted today to have a conversation about the Ruggie Principles with my colleague, Angela Maria Velez, who is based in Colombia, and the esteemed Luis Fernando de Angulo. So great to have you both here. Why don't I go ahead and have you introduce yourself? Angela, Luis Fernando, over to you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here with Luis Fernando and you, Michelle. Thank you for the invitation. I'm the director of the Colombia office at CIPE, so hi.
Thanks for joining us. Luis Fernando?
Yes, hello, Michelle, Angela Maria, my friend for many years. I am currently senior advisor to the Center for Responsible Business and a member of the Council for the Human Rights and Business Institute in London. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for these very interesting conversations that we are going to have today.
We're really excited to have you here. I am in part really glad that you're here because a lot of the work that I do at CIPE focuses on compliance and compliance that is related to different sorts of principles, human rights due diligence. Sometimes other folks talk about it as ESG, labor rights. So I think there is this huge umbrella of work that I work on, and I'm just curious to have conversations with you about the Ruggie Principles, your work in Colombia, setting up that framework, and how things have shaped up in Colombia around this. So I guess the first thing I better ask, just so that some of our listeners who may be less familiar will know, can you please explain and tell folks what the Ruggie Framework is or what the Ruggie Principles are, and just so they'll have context and know what we're talking about?
Angela, you want to go ahead?
No, I would like to start saying that for me, it's a real pleasure to be here with Luis Fernando. As I said, we are very good friends for a lot of years now, but also because he's a great expert on human rights and business because of his experience in many companies in Colombia, but also because of his work in Asia and Africa. And also, as he explained, working with the Institute of Human Rights and Businesses that John Ruggie led for many years before he passed away. So really, it's a pleasure for me to be here with the expert. So I will allow the expert to explain about Ruggie Principles.
The issue of human rights in business was a very problematic thing to address and was very contentious between civil society, governments, and for many years it was a central topic at the Human Rights Council, a branch of the United Nations. So, and it was actually, it stagnated because the parties were so polarized that they could never get to an agreement, and they were always talking about a treaty. And a treaty takes 30 years, 40 years to work, if it ever happens. So Kofi Annan, the same Secretary of the United Nations who was also the founder of the Global Compact, asked John Ruggie, a professor at Harvard, and also who was also an undersecretary at the United Nations, to develop a framework where parties could come along and could help move the issue of human rights and business forward. And it took him about 3 years to travel really around the world to consult, to understand the issues, what was contentious, what not, where were the point of where parties could meet. And he came after 3 years with a framework that was based in 3 pillars. The obligations of states to protect human rights, and which is states cannot delegate the protection of human rights. The responsibility of businesses, and by business we understand a broad range of enterprises, private, public, of different nature. But here the difference, to protect when we are talking about states, and to respect when we talk about businesses. This was the second pillar, and the duty to provide remedy in cases where human rights are infringed. And this duty belongs both to state and businesses, because one of the huge findings was that once harm it was done, then nothing happened, and no reparation. Most of the cases, no reparation took place. That was the framework. Of course, I'm simplifying very much for the sake of time, but that was it. And he presented that to the Human Rights Council, and then the Human Rights Council presented that to the General Assembly, and it was the first time that a decision was taken unanimously, and a new mandate emerged for Professor Ruggie to operationalize the principles. So he took another 3 years consulting on the practices, on the barriers, on the processes required to make that framework work. And he came up with 31 principles called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business, on Human Rights and Business, which informed the three main actors here, which is civil society, states, and businesses, how to proceed in ensuring that human rights are protected and respected, and remedy is provided when infringements occur. And the core for businesses became due diligence. This was extremely interesting because it provided the steps and the parameters to answer the question, what needs to be done to ensure that we can respect? It's not just declarations and we are doing efforts and we want to do it. No, it is what has to take place in the business decisions, in business planning, to ensure that the decisions in companies follow the commitment to respect. That was a big step because from the business side, especially from the legal profession, we had found many barriers because identifying risks or potential harm was considered by the legal advisors to be almost a declaration of guilt. However, he came up very smartly after consultations with the American Bar Association, for example, with the idea of lending from a term that is very common in the commercial and civil law, which is due diligence. Due diligence is applied to business decisions, to fusions, acquisitions, which is exactly the same logic, which is let us understand what could happen if we take this decision or that other. Only that now the question is what can do harm if a company does things the normal way, or what measures need to be taken in advance to ensure that harm is not inflicted. And then the other pillar is remedy, which is a logical consequence of due diligence, which is if you know what has to be prevented, you can know what you have to do if something happens that impacts the exercise and enjoyment of rights. And so this becomes a virtual circle that also, because the remedy informs then better due diligence. So this is basically in very simple words. The thing, when I say simple words, doesn't mean that the United Guiding Principles are complicated. One of the great contributions of Professor Ruggie is that he simplified, he made understandable the very complicated original language of human rights. And I don't know, Angela Maria, if you would agree with me that the human rights legal language is extremely complicated.
I agree completely. I'm a lawyer, and I can tell every single time that I talk with entrepreneurs that it's really difficult to explain human rights. And also, it's difficult to explain the fact that they are connected with human rights. The first reaction in companies, at least in Colombia, is I didn't kill anyone. So why are you talking about human rights with me? Well, there is an answer, but it needs to be explained in the language of entrepreneurs, not in the language of the lawyers. So yes, it's difficult, and as Luis Fernando said, the great opportunity here is that it's very clear. A list of steps with examples, because it's not only the principle but the explanation that it has below that give a really good guidance to the companies to know what to do when they have to face this part of their businesses, because human rights is part of the businesses.
No, this is really great. I think you've given us a great definition, so anyone who was less familiar now knows and has a really good context for understanding what business and human rights, what it means, and sort of what we're talking about. I think the thing that you both have hit on is sort of the steps, the process. What is it that you need to do to ensure that you have a duty to prevent harm, and what are the steps? What is your due diligence? What do you do there to make sure that you're not infringing or violating human rights? I think the reason I feel this connects so well to my work is because, of course, I take that due diligence part, and that's where all of where compliance comes in, right? But I think of compliance not as just checking off the things, I've done all the things, but it's also sort of a type of culture in a way that you need to think. And I think it requires transparency and accountability on the part of the private sector in particular. I wonder if one of you, Luis Fernando, if you wouldn't mind sort of giving us your thoughts on what role you think transparency and accountability play in sort of, I think you could speak maybe to the Colombian private sector's efforts, but also I think just in general, the efforts of the private sector to really enforce and adhere to human rights standards.
I think that this is a great question, Michelle, because the United Guiding Principles are, for me, and I would like to see to hear what you think of this. The United Guiding Principles are more an ethical framework, and it's not a legal code. So when we think of what transparency and accountability, what role does it play in the implementation of guiding principles? They are the foundations for a thorough implementation. Without we would fall in the traditional, in the complicated situation of window dressing on human rights. So if an organization is not striving to reach a culture of openness, transparency, accountability, and accountability includes reporting and openness to hear what their stakeholders have to say about a possible risk and impacts. Um, this is where companies start moving in the right direction and engaging with stakeholders in a very, very productive way, and I would say in a conflict avoidance way, which is very important for businesses too. I think that if we were to see a company having strong values, robust transparency, reporting, and accountability processes, probably that company is already implementing the UNGPs.
I think that's a really great way that you've summarized that. And I agree 100%. Whenever I talk about this particular issue with anyone, it's always a question, well, what law applies? You know, what law am I making sure that I don't violate? It's an interesting conversation because my response oftentimes is, I'm not sure that the law per se really matters. It's the ethical behavior that underlies it. And a lot of times if you've got an ethical sort of foundation that helps you, as I think you just as you just said, it helps to actually, if you're already behaving that way, chances are your probability of applying here we're talking about the United Nations Guiding Principles, but a lot of other regulations that might touch on similar aspects, you're already most likely in line with what those principles or those laws are looking for. I know that both of you have experience in Colombia and all over the world, really seeing sort of companies try to put these principles into action, trying to be ethical. I wonder what sort of tools or what sort of practices have developed maybe in Colombia, maybe throughout the world that you've seen the private sector engage in to help them, achieve this goal of being ethical and sort of conforming with human rights standards.
Yeah. Do you want to mention some, Maria?
Yeah, well, let me give you a framework in the case of Colombia for that answer before Michelle, because the fact that we have had an internal conflict for so many years now, where we have seen massive violation of human rights around the country. Well, it's a place where you can see the impact on the business sector, but also it's important to know that there is a fact that there are some companies that have been linked to human rights violation. The truth is that most of them, mainly the ones that are in the regions most affected by violence and poverty, those companies has to learn how to respond to these challenges of human rights. So at the same time they are doing their businesses there, they have to adapt their operations to those circumstances and create a culture that maybe is not like the common thing. It's not that the companies are really prepared to face the fact that they have to get involved with human rights because it's not on their nature. So in the case of Colombia, we have seen a lot of companies that individually or collectively have created strategies to protect their interests, but at the same time to ensure that they are respecting human rights, that they are understanding what they have to do, that they are not only getting the information about what is going on in their areas of influence, but also how to be more transparent, how to report, and regarding your first question, being accountable of what is going on. So I will stay there to allow Luis Fernando to give specific examples. But as I said, I think the case of Colombia is a really good example on how to be prepared and how to show results on the design.
I would say that the best performance in human rights integration is in a company's management is understanding how the do no harm principle, which I already mentioned, is integrated into management systems, which means that everyone is responsible for having that into their operational guidance. This approach follows the steps of strong health, safety, and environment management systems that many companies follow, especially from what I know in the oil and chemical industries, in the large mining industry. HSE, which is very strong and is based on preventing harm, managing risks, and is based on a continuous improvement approach. So, if this very strong, very successful approach to preventing harm, preventing risk, preventing harm has been so successful, the question is why cannot be applied to preventing harm in the human rights field, and I mean all human rights, as Ruggie does. And companies that have taken that step, not to get satisfied with having a declaration or just a human rights policy, but ensure that everyone understands and everyone does it every day in their operational work. Those end to be success stories, and very interestingly, those are companies that do perform, and there have been some meta research, meta studies showing that companies that follow this type of approach are also companies that are quite successful in keeping costs right, in following in achieving their goals. So I would say they work very close together. Lean, clear, accountable businesses are also the result of commitment with these type of values and processes.
I think you're doing an amazing job of answering my questions before I get an opportunity to ask them. So thank you for just naturally moving into what would have been sort of my well, how do we know if a business is, if they're doing well? What are the hallmarks? So lean, clear, accountable. I think those are really sort of very clear sort of things that we might be looking for. I wonder a little bit about the opposite side of that. I wonder what are some of the challenges that either in Colombia or that you've seen in the work that you do. What are some of the challenges that businesses face as they're trying to make this transition and become a business that is respecting human rights in their operation?
For me, the two biggest challenges, at least in the case of Colombia, and mainly of my vision was working with Luis Fernando some years ago, but I think that's still the same thing. One is culture. It's really, really difficult to face the fact that the businesses needs to connect with this. Of course, there are some sectors which that comes easily because of the international standards. Let's say the extractive industry, they have so many things to solve in the international environment, so many standards that they have to answer to, where they need to face the fact that they need to learn about that. But that not happen in some other sectors. But the other thing that happens when you have violations of human rights is the fact that many people think that the companies are the ones that has to protect human rights, which is not the case. So when you have a company that is everybody's hoping around that they are going to solve the problem, that they are going to bring the army, that they are going to fix the whole thing, that they have to answer everything, that's become a problem, because the reaction, the way for the company to answer becomes really different. I don't know what Luis Fernando thinks about it.
I am fully in agreement with you, Angela Maria, that culture is of the essence. Is the willingness to work, because this is ethical, again, what we mentioned before. But I would add to that the willingness to engage stakeholders and to live with the consequence of a transparent engagement, with the purpose of understanding what are the way what are the ways in which stakeholders feel the impacts of a business operation. So let me work on an example, because this is very abstract, perhaps. If a mining operation is doing their work on a social impacts of a large operation, and they draw their baselines, social baseline, environmental baselines, etc. But if they do not go and explain and talk with the stakeholders in language that is understandable, and provide that information in here, probably many possible impacts and many possible solutions will get missed. And because the stakeholders probably will say, have not identified this impact, this situation, our own vulnerable aspects. So I think that an obstacle, if I can say so, is not being committed to open, strong, robust stakeholder engagement, which leads, of course, to situations where when impacts occur, the solutions and the reparation and remedy probably will fail as well, because stakeholders have not been adequately consulted. This is I'm calling attention to, because many of those operational remedy systems and claim and lines that are used to set claims to companies, if they are not prepared in ways that really connect with stakeholders, the design of remedy and reparation will fail, which means that the whole system can fail by not engaging productively with stakeholders.
I think something that you've pointing out, that culture is essential, this commitment to transparent engagement with stakeholders seems to be are really, really essential to the work and the success perhaps of the work, or maybe on the other side of the challenges of the work. So I think this has been, it's good to talk through this so that for someone who is listening and they're wondering, well, what are we supposed to do? What are my steps? What should I be doing? I think you've laid out two really important criteria: the commitment and understanding culture, and that transparent engagement. So I think we are just about at time, and I didn't get a chance to ask all my questions, but honestly, you both answered questions that I didn't get a chance to ask. So just because I didn't ask them doesn't mean we haven't talked over these things. You've both really done a great job. And I hope for those who are listening, they have a good sense of sort of challenges, opportunities that sort of lie within the Ruggie framework, and they have a good sense of what they might want to think through if they're trying to understand where their company is in terms of this. I want to thank you, Angela, and I also want to thank you, Luis Fernando, for joining me today. Thank you both so much for your time and sharing your expertise on this. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope that the listeners find this as useful and as eye-opening as I have.
It has been a pleasure, Michelle. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation, and let's send a message to the entrepreneurs. Human rights and businesses is a really good opportunity to learn about due diligence. So let's go to that.
Listen and subscribe to SIPE's Democracy That Delivers, wherever you get your podcasts.